Right. Thank you guys very much for joining us on our webinars. Today we are looking at attributes and how they can be used. What are some of the features involved with attributes, and how that can make your experience a little bit better for your users. Um, as a side note, the although attributes what we're calling in 4.5 attributes have always been known in the past as user groups and user codes. So along with creating many new functions along with these attributes, we also decided to make a branding change on what those were called. Instead of user codes and user groups, which inherently had little meaning to someone who hadn't gone through training, we decided to call them attributes, which has some inherent meaning for people who are just learning about them. Also, many of the features that are going to be discussed today are features that are available only in 4.5. So these are things that you can look forward to with the 4.5 release. I will point out the couple that have always, or at least are there for those of you who are using or who are not on 4.5 yet. So one of the great things about attributes is it really gives our administrators the ability to create new places for data to be stored within the application, and instead of having to create new database tables and then pay to have development done to create a place for that new data to be displayed in the one application, you can simply use these attributes to create pages, create new sections within existing pages, but really just gives you a good foundation for storing data that maybe we didn't think about, data that we didn't think that you might need to be capturing. So we're going to talk about some of those key attributes today. Feel free to ask questions as we go through this. There's a lot of information I'm going to try to cover, but starting, I guess, with just the basic understanding of some of the feature that goes along with this, which is just having a place to store additional data. One of the great features built in with these attributes in 4.5 is the ability now to relabel what those standard elements or the basic elements of the attribute are. So every attribute has an attribute code associated with it, a begin date, end date, status, and note. And when you created a new attribute, those values always showed up on the page. And although that wasn't necessarily bad, it also made it so that it was a little, if you weren't using all of those fields, it could be confusing for some of our users to see those extra pieces of information. And they were always labeled the same thing. In fact, they were always labeled as user group or user code, begin date, end date, status, and note. With this release, attributes now have the ability for those components to be labeled. So in the example that I have here under precision data storage is the label that's going to show up in one. Instead of it saying attribute code, it's going to be labeled year, because that's the data that I'm storing within that particular part of the attribute record. Begin date I'm storing as of date. And because there's no label set with end date and there's no label set with status, those two pieces of information are not going to be displayed on the page at all. So you only need to display on the page the information that you are collecting or that you want collected within that attribute. The other cool thing about this new setup is that you now can specify which of those elements are required when a new record is added. So that's what that RQD column is, and just setting a flag in front of that will allow the attribute to take on those settings. One of the other nice things about, even though this is new in 4.5, the ability to set these labels, you can, once you get 4.5, go in and update any of the labels on your existing attributes that are out there. So you can make these changes. Only thing I want you to be consistent about is we still don't want you to make changes to the attribute type or the attribute definitions that are out there. Those would still cause problems if you were deciding to make a change on whether or not it's a submodule attribute or whether or not it's a regular page attribute. So giving you the ability to change the label set required on the attribute component, the basic components. We've also are setting then within the 15 user variable fields, allowing those to be set up as required or optional or required as well. There's been changes made so that you functionally you're going to be adding codes a little bit differently, but still going to be there. If you create a drop-down list, you have the ability to edit those codes within the attribute itself. So once you set up an attribute, those attributes values will show up on the page. And you'll see this is an example at the bottom of the page here, bottom of page 1. The only information that's available for our users to fill out is the information that has a label associated with it. So we no longer have extraneous date fields that we don't use or status fields or note fields, just what you need. And that should help to clean up some of those pages as you're using them. Within attribute definitions, this is part of the setup that you go through with when you're building a new attribute. Not a lot of changes in here. We will see some additional changes with functionality as far as rules that are being applied as you set up certain attributes. Part of those rules, part of the definitions that you can set with an attribute includes the ability to have an attribute part of constituent search. So those are going to bring into the constituent search page the ability to search by an attribute code, and the attribute status. That's not anything new, but it is something that's great if you're out there collecting information. You can get those people who have certain attributes and codes and certain statuses right from the constituent search page. There's also the option to allow an attribute to be part of constituent profile. There are some limitations on what kinds of attributes can show in the constituent profile, and we are now going to be handling that with logic built into the setup. So it kind of depends on what kind of an attribute you have defined. The attributes that can be in constituent profile have to be attributes that are dealing with a constituent. So if you have an attribute on the fund page, that's not something that shows up in constituent profile. It's not constituent based. So that's still there. One of the things that's new about this, which I find extremely exciting, is that in the constituent profile, if you have an attribute that's built as a submenu item, so for example, this is an example of a attribute that has been added to an event. So it shows up on the attendee page of an event. It used to be that if you had an attribute that was tied to as a submodule, so it's showing up on another page, that you did not see that information in constituent profile. That change has been made now so that you would see that information within the constituent profile. In this case, we have the main event, this JDG00 or 00, and that has the reply and whether or not they attended or not. But then because we added this attribute to the event called event survey questions to retrieve, I now see the results of those survey questions that were part of that event registration. So submodule items can be part of constituent profile now. And that can be turned on also later, so on your existing attributes, by setting the show in constituent profile to yes. So let's take a look at the different attribute types. If you've not been using user groups or attributes up until now, there's several different ways in which they can be used that determine where they show up and how they can be used. So there's 5 different attributes types that are available within the setup. The first is we just have labeled as constituent. So if you build an attribute that is this constituent attribute type, the only place that these are going to show up is when you're on the constituents page and you go to the constituents module, go to the attribute page, and you'll see them in that list. So this is where all of the attributes really are displayed. But you can specify that they only that's the only place that they can be by setting up an attribute as constituent. The second option is to set it up as a module. So this is talking about placement. So if I set up an attribute to be by module, that means that we're creating an attribute that will be displayed within a module. So if I say attribute type of module, and then I'm going to specify which module it belongs in. So if I say constituents, then I'll find this new page under the constituents module called whatever the name of my attribute is. The third option here is submodule. And submodule is also about placement. So instead of having a unique page for the attribute, a submodule exists within another record. So for example, I might have an attribute that I'm collecting information about something about a specific manager. So I can create an attribute. Maybe I'm going to track goals for managers. I can create a goal attribute, assign it as a submodule, and assign the page that it belongs to as the manager page. That goal information then is going to show up on when you go to the manager page by drilling into a specific manager. On the bottom of the manager page, you'll see that attribute. So those have really been there for a while. The 2 new attribute types are composite and event. And as we look at a composite attribute, it's really a unique way to let you build a new page, so similar to what you might do with module, and that is going to let you build a page within a module, but it's going to be a composite page, or it's going to be a parent page. And within this composite page, you'll be able to add other attributes to this composite page. Let me just show you this example. So what we're looking at the top of this page for this composite attribute is we're seeing the fields that we're building within the composite page. So I've got major gift cap, major gift score, planned gift score, campanile score, and these are all different elements or data elements that we are going to have displayed on this composite page, this attribute. One of the interesting things about building a composite attribute is you'll notice on the right-hand side of that page where it says calculated via selection wizard query, the data that's being displayed in that section, in that composite attribute section, is actually being pulled from somewhere else. So your group does not populate the data manually by choosing it from a drop-down list, for example, or from a date field. Instead, every time you go to this page, that query is going to run, or those queries are going to be ran, and it's going to pull that information from somewhere else. This example, we're pulling major gift cap and planned gift score and research code. That's all coming from the ratings pages or from other places within the prospect module or from the master record. There's also a field in there called research asset totals. And that field is being populated based on the content of some of the other attribute pages, or excuse me, some of the other attribute records that are built within this composite attribute page. So the top section shows these fields, the major gift cap through research asset totals. Underneath that section are a series of other attribute pages or attribute records, one called ISU business asset, another called ISU real estate, ISU philanthropic information, external assets. The idea behind this page was to create a summary record for research that shows a bunch of research information, data points about a constituent, and then give the research team the ability to add additional information in each of these other attribute records about their business assets or real estate assets, and then roll that amount, that total amount from each of those attributes, from business assets, real estate, so on and so forth, into a total that shows up at the top of the page. And every time you come into this page, this data is always then recalculated to show the most current information on that page. From what we've seen, this can be a very powerful addition to attributes, being able to bring this kind of rolled up information into this top section while still allowing people to see grouped kinds of attributes at the bottom of this page.
Bob, quick question.
Yeah.
Is the data from the results of these queries, is that stored on that user code record when that is run, or is that unreachable from the database perspective?
It is reachable. The difficulty, I guess that's not the right word. It gets recalculated when you come to this page. So,
right.
And if you haven't been to this page, but the data changed somewhere, for example, the ratings information had changed or whatever, if you hadn't been to this page, it would not have been updated yet into this attribute record. So although it's available from a query directly, it may not be the most recent information.
Thank you,
that makes sense. Okay, good. Any other question about this composite attribute option?
I actually have a question, Bob. This
Yeah.
is Larissa. So we built several of these user groups on a different page, on the prospect information page. Would we be able to move them easily to their own page in order to access this composite attribute feature?
It is not. It's not going to be easy, but we can help script that, because I know that was one of the things that we kind of discussed as you were building these.
Right.
You needed some place to store them, so we said, let's go ahead and do that. We can move them for you. If that's,
okay.
It's not an easy process. So there's scripting, there's unique keys that need to get built and all that kind of stuff. So, but that's something that I'd kind of anticipated we would end up needing to do. So we'll probably get a little estimate together for being able to move those from where they are now into a composite page for you.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. Other questions about composites? Composite attributes. Okay. Another very exciting addition is with event attributes. I'm going to go in here, sorry. Make another update here. Okay. This is pretty cool. We have, in events, had the ability for us to create special options and dietary options, which are wonderful for event registration, allows our registrants the ability to go through registration and choose, really answer two questions that we can present to them. And it was really good for a number of years, but we've really realized that there wasn't enough. So what we've done is we've integrated the attribute functionality within into the event setup. So this is an example of where we can use the 15 user variables that are assigned within an attribute as additional pieces of information that you can collect while somebody's going through event registration. So what we're seeing on the page are 5 of the user variables that are part of an attribute. Professional area, pledge class year, country of origin, birth date, phonetic name spelling, that we built into an attribute. And then we assigned that attribute to be used on an event, so that when somebody goes through online registration, they are presented then with the questions that were built into the attribute. So in this case, we had these professional areas. That is what you saw was set up at the top of the page, and at the bottom of the page, we're seeing kind of the rendition of what that looks like when they go through the registration process. Given drop-down lists to control their entry, you can also specify which of those questions are required for them to enter in order for them to proceed through event registration. And everybody who is registering, that's attendees and guests, has the ability then to answer these questions. So it's not just one set of questions for the entire registration process. It is seriously asking these questions for each of the people that are being registered, attendees and guests. So you define the attribute, how many variables there are, what are the variables, what are the fields look like, are they drop downs, are they date fields, are they currency fields? You assign that and say, well, I want to use that attribute within this event. So it pulls the definitions in. And then at the bottom of the attendees page or at the bottom of the guest page, depending upon which record we're looking at, there's a new browse component called attribute. And that is going to show you the results of whatever they filled out while they're going through registration. So we have these integrated services again, and those are working with Wealth Engine, Donor Search, HEP, matching gift employers. And what's nice about this integration is for our wealth screening is that gives us the option, gives you the ability to click on a link within the prospect page on a prospect record and have that information move directly from the Wealth Engine site or the Donor Search site, and that information gets put into an attribute record. So that attribute lives then as a way for us to be able to report on the information that's being sent down from either of those two product companies of Wealth Engine and Donor Search. Beyond the ability to do the one-off refresh of somebody's wealth information, you can also work directly with Agilon to produce a web screening that will let you send a lot of records through to those two products and have that information all come back down, hundreds of records, thousands of records at a time, if that's what you'd like to have. But it's really great to have that information pushed back into an attribute record that you can then look at and report on. We also do work with matching employers. So if you have a subscription with HEP, or if you need to do a screening with HEP, you can get a list. You can send them your employers, and they will send you back then a list of all of those employers and all of the subsidiaries of those companies, letting you know whether or not those are matching companies or not. And that information comes back with what's their matching ratio and what programs don't they match. But as you can see on the screenshot, this is the list of some of the subsidiaries of Aegon. But what that really helps out with is the process of the employer match screen that's part of the business page now. When you type in an employer name, it looks at not only constituent records that you have in the system, but it will also look at this attribute record of matching gift employers to allow you to help find somebody that they work for. So maybe they work for Aegon Direct. That's not one of your constituents. Because it's in this attribute of subsidiaries, the MEMI relationship will be built with Aegon, which is the parent company of this Aegon Direct. So another great use of something we've integrated using an attribute built within the product itself. I also want to talk just a couple more things here. We should finish on time, even though we had our issues. The next is this Webform integration. Webform integration gives you the ability to create an attribute record. So this is one that you guys are going to all get to see. You're going to have there's an attribute record that I created called Client Webinar Survey, and it has 5 questions in it. You can see what they are. They're set up with drop-down lists associated with them. What I wanted to do was create this attribute so that I can see, along with everybody's information or everybody's record that has registered for this webinar. At the end of the webinar, actually at 1:30 my time, so 15 minutes ago, everybody should have gotten an email. If I had flagged you as attended, everybody should have gotten an email that says, hey, I want you to take a survey, and that survey then has a button that you can click on that will take you right into the interface that will let you fill out the information for this attribute. And so while you guys look at your emails, I'd like you to go ahead and look at that right now. Since we're almost done, it's a great chance for you to go and look at this. And I got this message to take a survey. Now, this survey is specific to you. I'm actually using Dave's computer. So when you click on the Take Survey button, it should take you to a new screen with those 5 questions on it. I'm going to give myself some good marks here. You guys can be brutally honest with me. So I'm going to go ahead and mark all of these as a very good session. Awesome. And I'm going to save this. What's, I think, very cool about this setup is if I go now to where this event is set up, and so that's in the events module. I'm going to go to the attendees page for this event, and I'll go ahead and look at Dave's record because that's the record that I just completed. So we should see a section right in here, and so what I will do at the end of this session is go in and look at all of my survey results right in each of your attendee records to see how we did today. There's other options along with Webform integration. Any types of questions that you might want your constituents to fill out can be handled with a web form. For example, if you want to put out preferences for how people should be getting their receipts, or how you want to give them control over how they want to tell you their communication restrictions. Those can be delivered as web forms, and your constituencies can save those links, and they can access that information at any time and update the attribute information, and that will be updated in one immediately. So the very last thing on this list, which is, I think, something that people are often afraid of with these attributes, is their ability to report on them. And really, with the use of 2 features, one of them being an ID filter query and selection wizard, it makes it very simple for you to include certain people based on their attribute settings. If your query includes criteria from an attribute like male preferences, if you use an ID filter, it makes it very simple to pull that information in without having to know a lot about Selection Wizard to make that happen. And the other thing is building filter fields. The attribute by itself lives on the table with every other attribute user code. So the built-in drop-down list when you hit the user code table is all of the user codes. And that's very simply controlled by having a new filter field added for that attribute, so that when you have a runtime prompt on an event or on a report, it will just show you the attribute codes for that specific attribute. And if you're not doing that already, that would be something that would be well worth your time to have a training on how to report on attributes, to do both of these things, of building ID filter queries and building new filter fields. So we covered a lot of information. Attributes are very powerful. They're something that should be used quite a bit within one because of their flexibility and because of all of the different ways in which it allows you to store data without having to build new tables within the system that you then have to provide custom work to make them available within one. So I hope that with this new information, I hope that just by getting a chance to look at attributes again, this is giving you some fresh eyes from which you can start to use attributes going forward. Does anyone have any other questions about attributes that I might be able to help answer? Otherwise, I want to thank you guys for sticking with me, and I will go ahead and end our session and look forward to seeing you guys again for our next web session, which is next week, Wednesday. Thank you guys very much. Have a great afternoon.